I've got the names of the refineries that refine Russian oil and sell it back to us. And I just want to put it out there, put it on the record so that we should think about either applying sanctions to these refineries or creating some type of legislation where we're not allowed to buy oil from these refineries or source them. And I'm just going to put it out here for the record. In India, we have the Vadinar refinery, which is 49% owned by Russia's state oil company Rosneft, and they receive Russian oil and they sell Russian oil refined product back to us. We have the Jamnagar refinery in the Gulf of Kutch on India's western coast, which is a leading destination for Russian crude arriving in India. We have the Bharat Petroleum, which is a state-run company. And then we have the Hindustan Petroleum, another state-run company. In Turkey, we have Star Refinery, which concluded a deal with Russian oil company Lukoil. And in China, we have Sinopec Group and CNOOC. I think that those are all companies that buy Russian oil. When we talk about India, China, and Turkey, we're talking about specific companies. We don't have to sanction India, China, and Turkey. We can just go after the companies that are buying the oil. My name is Bill Browder. I'm the CEO of Hermitage Capital Management and head of the Global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Since the murder of my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, in Russia in 2009, I've taken on the mission to get justice, and that has resulted in the passage of something named after him called the Magnitsky Act, which was passed in the United States in 2012, passed in Canada in 2017, here in the UK in 2018, in the EU 2020, and Australia in 2021. There are now 35 countries in the world that have operating Magnitsky Acts, and through this process I've become an expert on sanctions, on implementation of sanctions, and it's led me to all sorts of discussions around the world with different policymakers, government officials, and others. I'm pleased to be here today to address this very important issue of whether sanctions are working or not and what we can do to improve them.
Thank you very much, and I know that you have absolutely worked relentlessly on this and campaigned relentlessly and published a book on it, which I've had the pleasure of reading. And I think that, clearly, since the Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the lessons that have been learned through implementing the Magnitsky sanctions are now very valuable in terms of seeing what needs to change for this much wider crime that's been undertaken. And I wondered if you could start, Mr. Browder, by just saying what you would like to see change in terms of the current regime that the UK is operating in response to the invasion of Ukraine.
First of all, I want to say something really important and clear, which is that Putin has stated on a number of occasions that sanctions aren't working. He says sanctions aren't working. Look how great we're doing. We have great economic statistics. Everything is fine. Therefore, why are you suffering yourselves from having these sanctions because they're hurting you? And so the first thing I want to say is that sanctions are crippling Russia, and I think this is really important. And I want to back up and say that the numbers that you receive about the quote success of the Russian economy come from a country. The Russian State Statistics Committee produces those numbers. The Russians lie in every other area. I don't see any reason why we should believe those numbers coming out of Russia. And let me just go through in a very broad level the effects of sanctions, just so that it's all clear and laid out. A week after the war started, the West froze more than $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. They had $650 billion in their literal war chest. That was Putin's war chest. One of the reasons he felt confident going to war was that he had $650 billion of central bank reserves. In one fell swoop, we immobilized that money, and that money is no longer usable. We've also sanctioned, I believe at this stage, out of 98 oligarchs who were listed by the U.S. government as being sort of influential oligarchs. Here in the UK, I believe we've sanctioned 57 of them, and their money has effectively been immobilized anywhere they have that money. And that number could be in the order of magnitude of the central bank reserves of money abroad that they can't access. We have also said or sanctioned the foreign borrowing capability of the Russian government and Russian companies. And they were borrowing many tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars before all this thing happened. That's gone to zero. About 1,500 Western companies have retreated from Russia, and Russia has gone from plus 40 billion of foreign direct investment before the war started to minus 40 billion. So there's been an $80 billion swing. The big loophole, though, is the sale of oil. Russia continues to sell oil, not to us. The amounts of oil directly sold to us has gone down by 80+%. But whatever oil that used to be sold to us is now being sold to India, China, and Turkey. And the problem is, there's two problems. One is that they continue to get a lot of money from that oil, somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion a day. And second, the oil that's being sold to refineries in India, China, and Turkey, some of that oil comes back this way. About $23 billion worth of oil refined products is being sold back in this direction to the EU. And I believe that last year the UK bought $2.2 billion worth of that refined product. And so as long as Russia can sell the oil, Russia can use that hard currency to buy weapons, and they can use those weapons to kill Ukrainians. And so on one side, we're funding either or directly or indirectly, we're funding Russia to conduct their war. And on the other side, we're then funding the Ukrainians to fight back. And something has to give. And what Putin is hoping is going to give is that we're going to run out of patience to fund the Ukrainians. And we've seen evidence of that. And we saw this at the EU when the 50 billion euro package was being held up.
Not from this parliament.
No. We saw that not from this country, but but the United States, 61 billion. And so we need to figure out a way to continue to immobilize Russia's ability to conduct this war, and the best way to do that is to work on this oil.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the sanctions are crippling the Russian economy, that financial sanctions have been effective in catching the right people and some substantial amounts of money, but that the main loophole is through oil, which being fungible is somehow ending up in the UK. Is that a good summary of what I just heard?
Exactly what I've...
Thank you very much. That's really a fascinating place to start. Drew?
Yeah, thank you. In February 2023, you wrote an op-ed on seized Russian assets, saying that these should be used to fund the war in Ukraine. What impact do you think that would have if that went ahead, if seized assets were able to be used for the war in Ukraine? What impact would it have in Ukraine?
Well, quite simply, if the West, the UK, US, EU, and other allies were to confiscate $300 billion, that would change the whole nature of the war. This war, ultimately, when it comes right down to it, is a resource war. Russia has more resources than Ukraine. Putin is banking on the fact that as the war drags on, we're going to have less appetite than he has to conduct the war, and that we're going to stop funding. And we've seen evidence of that. When I say we, I say that as a collective we. If this money were to be confiscated, this is 5 times what what the U.S. had been dragging their feet on, 5 times the $61 billion that the U.S. had been dragging their feet on. And I think it would completely change the situation, and it particularly would change the situation in a context where we're almost 2.5 years into this war, and whether we like it or not, some of our allies are going to be less likely to fund this war. And I'm particularly concerned about what might happen in the United States. There's an election coming up on November 5th in the United States. If you read the opinion polls right now, it looks like Donald Trump is leading in the swing states, which would result in his victory. If he succeeds in becoming president, he's made it very clear that using his own words, this war would end in 24 hours. And what does he mean by that? I think he's made that also pretty clear, that he would stop funding Ukraine. If the United States stops funding Ukraine, U.S. provides roughly half of all financial aid to Ukraine. That means that either Ukraine will probably lose the war, or we then have to double down. And this money, this $300 billion, would solve that problem. It would basically be an insurance policy against that problem.
There's been an institutional reluctance to take these steps. What impact do you think it would have on the market?
I don't think it would have any impact on the market. It's so one of the there's 3 or 4 big objections that are constantly thrown out. The one of those objections is, oh my God, if we were to confiscate this money, that would totally destabilize international financial markets. That's just not true. The money that's been confiscated, that's been frozen, if that money were to be confiscated by all of the allies, if we didn't do it by ourselves, if we did this together with the United States, with the EU, with Switzerland, with Canada, with Japan, those are all the countries that have what are called reserve currencies. What's a reserve currency? It's a liquid currency that people can store their money in. And the argument is that, or the naysayers say, if we were to confiscate this money, then people wouldn't keep their money in our country, or wouldn't keep their money in the EU, or wouldn't keep their money in the US. But if everybody does it together, where would people keep their money? I can guarantee you they're not going to keep their money in Iranian rials. They're not going to keep their money in Argentine pesos. They're going to keep their money in stable economies. Another word that's used in this discussion is unexpected consequences. Well, there's one really, I wouldn't say it's unexpected, an expected consequence, which is that the message here, if we do this, is that if you launch a war of aggression, an unprovoked war of aggression against a neighboring country that did nothing, you're likely to have your foreign exchange reserves confiscated. Well, who else is looking at a neighboring country considering a war of aggression that has a lot of foreign exchange reserves? China. And China has a lot more to lose than Russia has in this regard. And I think that we should be thinking a lot about what we can do to deter China from unsettling the situation over there with Taiwan. And this is a pretty good example.
On the just to kind of push a little further on the market situation, the Royal United Services Institute have said that the banks and central banks should commit to stabilising the market in the event of the seizure of the release to Ukraine of the seized Russian assets. What's your view of that?
I don't think there's any stabilizing need to be done. The main action, the main destabilizing action happened a week after the war started. The action was we froze the money. Mm-hmm. The money has already effectively become not theirs. And so, I can understand why banks wouldn't want this to happen, because it complicates their lives if money is being confiscated. By the way, I should point out that all sorts of people told me for many years, as I was advocating for the Magnitsky Act, that this would be completely impossible, it would mess everything up, unexpected consequences, etc. And then eventually the Magnitsky Act came into being, and the only people who really now are unhappy about it are the people who are sanctioned. Basically, if you're not going to invade foreign neighbors, you have nothing to worry about, and 99.9% of the money that's floating around the international financial system has nothing to do with this type of action.
I'm hearing a strong view from you that it's really just the will to do this that's the issue, as opposed to the issues in the market.
Everybody's afraid of doing something different because that's different, and there's a lot of people that will be holding on to tradition because it's easier to do that. But let's also flip this thing over for a second. Let's come back to the scenario that we have to continue funding this and perhaps even double our funding because the United States steps back. So who funds it? The taxpayers of this country fund it. The taxpayers of the EU fund it. So should Vladimir Putin's legal rights to his money be more important than the taxpayers of this country's rights? I don't think so. And I don't think any of you would find any objection in your constituencies if you went and had that conversation. I think that we should be thinking about ourselves before we think about him.
You mentioned the EU just now. On the 8th of May, the EU announced plans to use the profit from seized Russian assets to aid Ukraine. What do you think of that action?
Well, it looks to me like a sort of a typical EU bad compromise. So there's no EU. There's not like a Mr. or Mrs. EU thinking about all the pluses and minuses and making decisions. You have 27 member states that are all negotiating with each other over this thing, with this argument and a few other arguments about why it shouldn't be done, and then the arguments about why it should be done, which is it's right, it's morally correct, it's financially correct, and it's politically correct. And they had this argument among 27 member states, and eventually they came up with this sort of fudge, which is to take the profits but not the capital. And from my perspective, first it's good to take something as opposed to nothing because Ukraine needs the money. But from my perspective, there's no difference between taking the profits and taking the money. To the extent, if we go to one of the other arguments about why this shouldn't be done is that there's no legal way to do it, which I disagree with, and we can talk about. How is it different taking the profits than taking the money? And so I think this is just, in a certain way, unfortunate because it prolongs the inevitable. I mean,
given your strong view that it is a fudge, but I think I also heard you say in there that it is at least something. Given that it's at least something, do you think the UK should follow suit, at least in that move?
What I think the UK should do is what the US has done. The US, well, let me take one step back. To the extent that there's any legal ambiguity about whether this money can be confiscated, the way you resolve legal ambiguity is to make law. That's what you do for a living. You make laws. And so the U.S., to address the possible legal ambiguity, passed something called the Repo Act. The Repo Act was passed along with the $61 billion aid package. And they've now resolved any legal ambiguity, and the United States government has the right to confiscate the money. What I would suggest is done here is some version of the Repo Act where, to the extent that there's any legal concern, that you legislate away that legal concern so that it can be properly done here. And by having the United States and the UK coming to that decision, it puts more pressure on the EU to do the right thing in the end.
Perhaps one very quick final question, because you've talked about the idea of getting everybody together to take this action. Given and I think you wrote about that in your article, so the US, Canada, Japan, the EU and Australia all need to unify around this. How likely is that? How likely is that to happen?
Well, I mean, it ended up happening. So when I started the Magnitsky Act campaign in 2012, it was only the U.S. who did it. And by the way, what I'm talking about with confiscating the reserves shouldn't take us 10 years like the Magnitsky Act. But I started with the U.S., and I was just one man. I was not the whole consensus of the world as we have right now that something needs to be done. But eventually we then got Canada, and then we got the UK, and then we got EU and Australia. Everybody will. It's the only logical, moral, rational thing to do. Everyone will come to the proper decision in the end, but it just takes some international pressure, diplomacy, reality, financial reality of the situation. And so I think it's likely to happen, but it's not going to happen unless we push for it. And that's, thankfully in this fight for the confiscating the reserves, it's not like just one man pushing for it. That we have a lot of people that believe this is the right thing to do.
And just to clarify, though, that you do think it needs to be done multilaterally.
It has to be done multilaterally because then it comes back to the issue which you've just raised, which is if one country does it, it does create the perception that that's not a safe country if another country hasn't done it.
Thank you. Siobhan.
Can I just say you're a complete inspiration for all of us who are campaigning for change in all sorts of campaigning spheres. So thank you very much. In your evidence to the committee, you spoke about how we can seize Russian state assets, but I wanted to look at assets owned by sanctioned individuals. The UK has frozen £22.7 billion worth of assets owned by private citizens and entities, but legally we don't have the tools to confiscate them. What measures would you suggest to confiscate those personal assets? Should we look at Canada's Special Economic Measures Act or something like that?
Well, I have a lot of experience in this area coming back to the Magnitsky case. So in the Magnitsky case, my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, was killed. He was killed for uncovering a $230 million government corruption scheme. We traced the $230 million to many different countries. We then would file criminal complaints with the law enforcement authorities of those countries to freeze and confiscate that money. And the crime took place in 2007. And we're still involved in criminal or assisting different law enforcement authorities in criminal litigation in 2024. And so what I've learned from this process is that when you're going up against an individual, using the legal system, which I think has to be done, it's an extremely cumbersome, time-consuming process. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. What I'm saying is that if we're looking for financial relief to Ukraine now, the Russian government has committed the crime. They've committed a crime of aggression. We have custody of their money. And we can confiscate their money, and it's all very clear. When it gets to an individual, the big problem is that the individual has property rights, and I don't think we should start confiscating individuals' money without going through a proper legal process. And the problem with those individuals' property rights is the first thing you have to prove is that individual was somehow formally connected to the Russian government and therefore bears some responsibility, and then proving that, and then you have to go through the rest of this process. I think that should be done. I think the oligarchs who are supporting the regime should have their money confiscated, but I think that's a longer-term process. I don't think we should ever unfreeze that money, but I think that the resources required to litigate that will be large, and I think that's something that needs to be thought about separately. And so I'm not saying it shouldn't be done, but I'm saying that in terms of the emergency that we have on our hands right now, the 80% of our efforts should be towards confiscating the state money, and then we can leave the other money frozen until we can figure out how to go about getting it.
As of the 23rd of February, 1,702 individuals and 298 entities have been subject to UK sanction. But there are many companies and individuals supporting Russia's war in Ukraine that have not been sanctioned. These include both Russian officials and oligarchs. If the government expanded the sanctions regime, who are the first people that they should target?
Well, so what I would say is so we were just looking at this, and let me just get the list out. So, so the U.S. government did a project in 2017 where they asked I think it was the Treasury Department to come up with a list of who the Russian oligarchs were who were closest to Putin, and it was a sort of an official legal assignment. The Treasury Department came up with a list of 96 individuals. It's a published list. And of that list, we actually in the UK have sanctioned 57. The US has only sanctioned 30, and the EU has only sanctioned 25. So we've done better, which is good. When I didn't know this until I got these numbers yesterday. So that's good. But that leaves us with 36 of these people not sanctioned. So what I would say, it's very easy. Let's get the list that the U.S. has produced. I mean, we could produce our own, but let's get the list that the U.S. Treasury has produced. Let's go down the list. Let's look at all the 36 people who have not been sanctioned, and if on the basis of the criteria that exists for the sanctions program for the invasion of Ukraine, we should then apply sanctions to them if the criteria applies. I think that would be the simplest, most broad way of doing it. I don't want to throw individual names out here today because I haven't done the research, but that's where I would start.
Let's hope 36 people are a bit worried right now.
Well, yeah, good. I mean, we're on Parliament TV, so...
In 2022, the government introduced a requirement for foreign businesses owning land or properties in the UK disclose their true owners and registered overseas entities. It's how we found out that Igor Shivalov, a sanctioned member of Putin's inner circle, owned 2 flats across the road from the Ministry of Defence, which were worth about £11 million. But there's still a loophole because anyone who controls an offshore company can continue to hide the ownership in that trust. Do you agree that we need to close the loopholes so that the legislation also targets trusts?
Absolutely. There's no reason. So transparency or sunlight is the best disinfectant, and much better than any government regulation or anything. If everybody knows who owns what, then we can, public can then be upset about all this type of stuff. Any loophole which allows transparency not to exist should be closed, and that's a great example. And there's probably a few other of these types of loopholes where people can continue to hide their ownership, and we should have none of that here. This should be a hostile environment for criminals, money launderers, dictators, and other people. It's not. There's plenty of legitimate people in the world who can come here, spend their money, bring good things to this country. We don't need the criminals.
I've got another question, but I realise I've been going on for a bit. So, sure, I've got one last question. To crack down on sanctioned individuals keeping money in the UK, the defence think tank RUSI has suggested that we create tripwires. That is where you create a new offence that you would then judge these oligarchs to have committed. Do you think that's a sensible way forward?
Well, I'm not familiar with the details of the proposal, so I don't want to comment on that. But I do want to comment on one thing which is really important, which is that one of the things which I learned about from all of the work we did on the Magnitsky case is that there is a whole sort of ecosystem of what we call enablers. These are people who, lawyers, accountants, trustees, company formation agencies, PR firms that work on behalf of bad people to help them launder their money, hide their money, and continue to manage their money when it's laundered and hid. And one of the things which, and I think that when we're talking about the amount of money that's been frozen in the UK, of 20, I think the number you mentioned was 23 billion, that's a drop in the ocean of how much money is actually in the UK that belongs to people who have done bad things. And the reason that's a lower number than the real number is because a lot of the money is hidden. Most of the money is still hidden. How do we unhide that money? I have an idea, and I've been talking about this since the war began, and that is that if we were to put a provision in law in the next iteration of the sanctions law, which said that any accountant, lawyer, trustee, etc., who worked for an individual who is sanctioned would have a duty of law to come forward to the government and share the information about the ownership of assets of the sanctioned individual. If you take the poachers and turn them into the gamekeepers, all of a sudden that number of 23 billion would probably go to 230 billion. And it would probably cause any future lawyer, accountant, etc., not to want to get involved in this thing unless they knew that their clients were proper, legitimate individuals.
Angela.
Thank you very much. I think that we've talked about sanctioning state-owned assets, but isn't it one of the features of the Putin regime that a lot of state-owned assets were actually taken out of Russia under the safekeeping of particular oligarchs, and there was a big battle between the old oligarchs and the Putin-affiliated oligarchs to have control of a lot of these state assets that are essentially being hidden in places like London. But so effectively the individual-owned assets aren't really individually owned at all. I mean, they are basically extensions of the state, and Putin would expect them to be returned to him if he wished to use them in any way. Doesn't this dissolve, for all intents and purposes, the distinction between individually owned oligarch assets and state assets?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, we've done the work, and we estimate that between the year 2000 and 2024, Putin and the top 1,000 officials have stolen $1 trillion from the Russian state, and Putin doesn't keep any of this money in his own name. The money is held by trustees and oligarchs and so on. And so that money should be immobilized for sure. There's no question. The only issue is it's a much cleaner legal case to go after the state's money than it is to go unpack that. And I do believe in property rights. You can't just broad brush and say that person is Russian, therefore their money should be confiscated. No, I think that's wrong. We can't do that. That would upset. Coming back to your original question, that would upset financial markets if people thought that they're just by being born in a country or having a connection to a country that does something bad, that would put all their money at risk. I mean, everybody has property rights and the legal right to represent themselves, but I do believe, and I completely agree with you, that most of the Russian oligarchs are trustees for Vladimir Putin, that the money being held is effectively the money that belongs to the Russian state, and that the legal process should absolutely begin to try to take that money away from them. But I'm just saying that it's going to be a very long, hard road, and in terms of dealing with the emergency, the current emergency, we shouldn't expect any financial results. Those financial results are going to come a decade from now if properly litigated, not today.
Rights, human rights, rule of law, very important for individuals. But what we've got here is effectively a criminal enterprise which has stolen assets from, you could call it the Russian state, I might say the Russian people, to use in this web of arbitrary behaviour and criminality, of which the oligarchs are the most obvious examples. How do we overcome rights that are clearly there for a very good reason, human rights, property rights, rule of law, to deal with this obvious laundering that's going on? And we'll answer that, and then there's another issue I want to raise with you.
Well, I mean, I think that the laws are actually in place to do something here.
Proceeds of crime?
The unexpected wealth orders, etc. and again, I've got very, very direct experience in this area and a very unfortunate experience in this area, which is, as I mentioned, the Magnitsky case, the 230 million, we traced all the money. The largest share of the 230 million came to the UK. And whenever we found money going to the country, we'd then file a criminal complaint with the relevant law enforcement authorities. And in most countries, the law enforcement authorities opened criminal cases. Here in the UK, they didn't. We filed a criminal complaint with the Serious Fraud Office, no case opened. With the Economic Crimes Department or of the Metropolitan Police, no case opened. Of what used to be called the Serious Organized Crime Agency, no case opened. With the HMRC, no case opened. With the National Crime Agency, no case opened. And eventually, well, I'll tell you why. Eventually, one of the people who I'd written to after he had retired from the National Crime Agency came to me, and he said, I thought a case should be opened, and I was overruled and under extreme pressure not to open a case by somebody very senior in the National Crime Agency. And what I've learned is it wasn't specific to our case. No cases. There was not a single economic crimes case from Russia opened since Putin has come to power in this country. Why? I don't think that I don't think it's malicious. I think it's the law enforcement agencies of this country are badly resourced. I think per capita, U.S. spends much more than the UK on these issues. But also the law. So you start out with a low budget in all these different agencies, and then you have this thing where if a case goes to court, and the government loses even on a minor procedural point in court, there's just like a disclosure order which they issued, which was been fought, and then the defendant wins. They've got to pay like £50,000 to the other side for the costs of that particular order. And these people don't even have the budget to start out with to do the case. And so with the incentives so badly skewed against them, what's the natural career reaction of an official in the National Crime Agency or the Crown Prosecution Service or whomever is you just don't open cases.
Which is why the UK is a centre for this kind of fraudulent activity and has been infiltrated by Russian money so badly. Exactly.
And I have direct experience working with many different countries. This is the worst. And I say that it's worse than like Latvia. In Latvia, you can actually conduct criminal cases. Here, there's almost a pride in not doing it. And the only way to fix that is to change the whole structure, which is, and I proposed this in the last sanctions bill that came forward, which is to take away any possibility of cost orders against the government. And then the second thing to do is to, if the government wins, if the National Crime Agency wins, they should keep the money and then use that money to fund future prosecutions. That's how they.
I mean, this is easily fixed.
All it is a couple lines, but it gets slapped down every time. And this should be a totally multi-partisan issue. There should be nobody against this. But the people who are against this are the legal community. The people who are against this are people who just
They're getting vast amounts of money out of representing oligarchs, though, aren't they?
They absolutely are.
But this is corrupting our country.
It's not corrupting. It's corrupted our country.
And in the US, they can keep the proceeds.
The Department of Justice keeps the proceeds when they do these confiscation orders.
I think that is a devastating series of observations which we need to take extremely seriously, and I also think that your suggestions for changing it are simple but would be very, very effective if they were put into place. However, it would mean that the ecosystem that you were talking about of enablers would have their standards of living hit, isn't that?
And they'll come to some committee like this, and then they'll tell you how it's going to completely change the world, and it's impossible, and if we do that, everything will be bad, and so on and so forth. That's what will happen. And somehow it all gets watered down and it doesn't happen. And I've specifically worked on these specific amendments with colleagues of yours in Parliament in the last sanctions bill, and it all got kicked out.
You might forward them to us as well so that we can have a look at them for our report.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But is it,
Stephen.
but just following on from what Angela's just said, Dame Angela's just said, the reality is, of course, is we've already given protection against coming back against the FCA in certain areas, so it would hardly be a surprise if we wanted to extend it to other agencies. The precedent is there already for us to use. Can I just take you back to sort of the beginning? Can we just run through some of the differences in various regimes? The Institute of Chartered Accountants of England said traditionally the UK's financial sanctions regimes were aligned with the EU and the US. They now think since Russian sanctions have come in, there's been some disparity in the sanction system. I guess, three questions follow on from that. One is, do you agree with that view? Do you think the EU and the US themselves are aligned? And actually, given what you said right in your opening remarks, are these minor differences that don't really matter given the scale of sanctions that's in place?
Well, so it's a problem that we don't have harmonized sanctions, and let me just give you a few examples. So, and as I said, the UK has actually done a better job in terms of sanctioning oligarchs than the US and the EU. And so, for example, you have Vagit Alekperov. He is the CEO of Lukoil. Lukoil is one of the most important oil companies in Russia and a great supporter of Putin. He's sanctioned here in the UK, but he's not sanctioned in the EU or US. You have Vladimir Potanin. He's sanctioned here. Vladimir Potanin is the CEO of Norilsk Nickel. He's also one of the people who Putin has been assigning to buy up interests in when a foreign corporation wants to pull out of Russia and they have to sell at pennies on the dollar. He's been one of the big recipients of like free money from people pulling out. He's been sanctioned here. He's been sanctioned by the U.S., but he's not been sanctioned in the EU. And so, what do you do if you're Potanin? You go to the EU. He can still travel to Courchevel and Cala di Volpe in Italy and all that kind of stuff. And so now we can't control who they sanction, but there has to be a very big effort to, and this is something that should be really pushed hard, is to harmonize these sanctions so that these people can't go anywhere, because as long as they can find loopholes. And by the way, in the Magnitsky case itself, the EU doesn't have. The EU only has human rights sanctions. They don't have corruption sanctions. We have human rights and corruption. U.S. has human rights and corruption, etc. And so all the people who were involved in the financial crime that Sergei Magnitsky was killed over, they can't travel here. They can't travel to the U.S. They can't go to Canada. They can't go to Australia, but they can go anytime they want to the EU. And until the EU plugs these loopholes, it's a big problem because it doesn't achieve the objective.
So at the beginning, I think you said there's been about 350 billion of sanctions. Have you made any estimate of how much money has evaded sanctions because of discrepancies in various sanctions regimes?
I don't have any estimate, but it's going to be a huge number because that's what these people do. I mean,
you've got the discrepancy in the regime, and then perhaps equally as importantly, you've got discrepancy in implementation. You've just
well, I mean, I could estimate here and now, which is that we've estimated that $1 trillion was taken out of Russia during this 24-year period, and we're only talking about a few $100 billion that's been caught. So there's probably a much greater amount, $700 billion of money, which is still floating around somewhere, which hasn't been touched because either sanctions or enablers are hiding the money.
Just in terms of implementation, as opposed to the difference in the regimes which you point out, and we recognise we should be pushing governments to become more unified on, where do you think the best implementation of sanctions regimes is happening? You've already spoken about the repo law in the US, and as I understand it in the US, there's now a law against wealth managers who act for sanctioned or potentially sanctioned individuals, or potentially individuals from sanctioned countries. Is that right? And is that a world-leading way of cutting off networks?
So the U.S. is always most aggressive in any kind of law enforcement sanctions work, and they're probably the best practice in terms of emulating things. But having said that, the UK has as I've mentioned, has sanctioned more oligarchs than the US has. The US is sort of like a supertanker, slow-moving, but you never want to be on the wrong side of the US when it comes to any of these types of things. Here, we're a little bit less aggressive about the whole thing, and so, as I said, a lot of these people have money in trusts. So, I can remember a story. It was about a big property located in I think it was owned by Alisher Usmanov, who was one of the sanctioned individuals, and I think a day before he owns this huge property up in Hampstead, and he just transferred it to his sister a day before the whole sanctions program came in. She became the beneficiary of the trust that owned the property, and so we should look at every one of these sanctions evasion mechanisms that they use, and we should legislate against it going forward. And it comes to moving things around.
So presumably, if we had a regime like the politically exposed persons regime, a sanctions exposed persons regime, I mean, you can be politically exposed, so members of your family have to declare things. If we had the same sort of regime in place and was implemented across multilaterally, that would start to fill the hole that you were talking about.
It would. Yes.
And one final question, if I may. We've talked about the different regimes that are around, particularly in implementation. How would you propose that the UK government should get multilateral agreement? What are we doing that we need to do more of to persuade others to fill the gaps in their regimes?
Well, I think the best way of getting people to fill the gaps in their regimes is to point out where they're not adequate. Sometimes diplomacy is appropriate. Sometimes polite diplomacy is appropriate, and sometimes one should be a little bit less polite. And we're in a war right now, whether we want to admit it or not. There's a war going on, and we're participants, and we shouldn't make any mistake about it. And at the moment, we can fight this war. At the moment, there's no bloodshed coming from. There's not a drop of blood from a British soldier. But we're fighting a financial war, and we should fight it as tough as we can fight it, because that's the battlefield we're on right now.
Thank you very much for your evidence, Mr. Browder, and for all your campaigning. Can you just use this final opportunity? Is there anything else that you wanted to recommend to this committee before we bring this panel to a close?
Well, so the one thing which we haven't talked about, and I think you're going to be talking about it in your next session, is the oil and where it goes. And I've got the names of the refineries that refine Russian oil and sell it back to us. And I just want to put it out there, put it on the record, so that we should think about either applying sanctions to these refineries or creating some type of legislation where we're not allowed to buy oil from these refineries or source them. And I'm just going to put it out here for the record.
Please.
In India, we have the Vadinar refinery, which is 49% owned by Russia's state oil company Rosneft, and they receive Russian oil and they sell Russian oil refined product back to us. We have the Jamnagar refinery in the Gulf of Kutch on India's western coast, which is a leading destination for Russian crude arriving in India. We have the Bharat Petroleum, which is a state-run company. And then we have the Hindustan Petroleum, another state-run company. In Turkey, we have Star Refinery, which concluded a deal with Russian oil company Lukoil. And in China, we have Sinopec Group and CNOOC. I think that those are all companies that buy Russian oil. When we talk about India, China, and Turkey, we're talking about specific companies. We don't have to sanction India, China, and Turkey. We can just go after the companies that are buying the oil. And just me saying that probably here in a public setting on the record where but if you start to say that, if you put this into your report, that's the kind of pressure that these companies don't need. I mean, they can get oil from anywhere. They don't have to take Russian oil. And if Russian oil doesn't find a home so easily, the price goes down, they get less revenues and they have less money to fight this war.